very much. The more exact title of my lecture today, the more exact title of my lecture today is The Early Essays of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks on the Religious Philosophy of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. So let me begin with three firsts. First is a negative one. Strikingly and surprisingly, the flagship journal of modern orthodoxy, Tradition Magazine, for the first 15 years of its existence, from its founding in 1958 until 1973, did not publish a single article devoted to Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought. Only in 1973, two back-to-back issues, the spring-summer dual issue and the fall issue, would there be essays devoted to Soloveitchik. I'll pass over the second essay, which appeared in the fall issue, The Religious Philosophy of Rabbi Soloveitchik, by this lecturer, at the time not yet 30 years old, and just beginning to teach rabbinic literature and Jewish thought at McGill University, and turned to the second of my three firsts, namely the first essay in tradition on Soloveitchik's thought. The essay, Alienation and Faith, which appeared in Tradition's spring-summer issue, and contains an acute, philosophically rigorous analysis and critique of Soloveitchik's The Lonely Man of Faith, was written by the then 25-year-old Jonathan Sacks, identified simply by Tradition's editors as, quote, the member of the faculty of Jews College in London, England. So no rabbi, no professor, no law. We must... What? At some point. Okay. We must pause for a moment to reflect on the boldness and daring involved in Rabbi Sacks' writing and publishing the essay. At the time, Sacks was a very young, unknown figure in North America, and this essay, as he recalls, and here we come to the third verse, was his very first published essay. And yet he took on and critiqued, respectfully to be sure, The Lonely Man of Faith. This quote, justly famous article, Sacks himself calls it, by Soloveitchik, the Rav par excellence, the leading and towering figure of modern Orthodox in North America, and he further published in Tradition of all places, in the Lion's Den, as it were. In contrast to Soloveitchik's claim of The Lonely Man of Faith, that, as Sacks phrases it, quote, religious alienation is not a phenomenon conditioned by time, but, quote, arises out of tension between two fundamental divine commands. Sacks offers an alternative phenomenology of the Jewish self, whereby alienation and loneliness are defective states, and the religious man of any age transcends divisions and exists in unmediated closeness to God, the world, and other Jews. True, Sacks hastens to add that this alternative phenomenology is often in contrast rather than disagreement. But that's a polite way of saying it's often in disagreement. Thus Sacks criticizes Soloveitchik's portrait of the committed religious Jew as both a conflicted, divided self and arising out of that division, a lonely self. This essay is a very rich and tightly argued one, perhaps the densest essay that Sacks wrote. One cannot but help think that the fact that it is the first essay he wrote and the densest may not be coincidental. This is neither the time nor place for a full analysis and critique. For purposes of time, I'll pass over both Sacks' discussion of Soloveitchik's portrait of the committed religious Jew as a conflicted, divided self, and his discussion of loneliness as contrasted with Soloveitchik's approach, and move directly to what emerges as a key theme in Sacks' characterization and critique of Soloveitchik. That is Soloveitchik's philosophy of withdrawal. So this theme of withdrawal, that's my main theme, plays a critical role in a key passage for The Lonely Man of Faith, which, as you can see from your handout, which hasn't been handed out yet, but if it were handed out, you could see from it, Sacks cites or alludes to 4 times in his essays on Soloveitchik. So by the time I finish, you'll know it very well. To be sure, in Alienation and Faith, this passage plays a minor role, but it plays an increasingly important role in Sacks' later essays. So in this passage, before we get to it, Soloveitchik is speaking, here's a background, about the uniqueness of Adam II's faith commitment and his absolute commitment to God. However, Adam I cannot really understand this faith experience and wants to translate it solely into pragmatic and cultural terms, which for Rabbi Soloveitchik is impossible. And were it possible, would strip the faith experience of its unique and special character. Soloveitchik continues, and here's a quote. So here's the money quote. It is here that the dialogue between the man of faith and the man of culture comes to an end. Modern Adam II, as soon as he finishes translating religion into the cultural vernacular and begins to talk the foreign language of faith, finds himself lonely, forsaken, misunderstood, at times even ridiculed by Adam I by himself. When the hour of estrangement strikes, the ordeal of the man of faith begins, and he starts his withdrawal from society. So the key word, withdrawal. From Adam I, be an outsider, be it himself. He returns like Moses of old to a solitary hiding place and his abode of loneliness. He experiences not only ontological loneliness, but also social isolation whenever he dares to deliver the genuine faith curriculum. So that's a statement of Rabbi Soloveitchik, which I'll be returning to. In Alienation of Faith, this passage is only briefly alluded to and paraphrased. Soloveitchik summarizing Soloveitchik's position right. So this is from Alienation of Faith. Neither majesty nor redemption can be reduced to the other and thus neutralized. Majesty requires the redemptive vision to give it creative enterprises ultimate validation. The content of this vision cannot be completely translated to functional concept. This internal rift is given additional poignancy in our time, which is an age primarily of technological achievement. And here comes Rabbi Sachs's paraphrase. Faced with a community of majestic men, the man of faith is bound either to betray himself or be misunderstood, and all that faces him is a retreat into solitude. But what happens in Sachs's later essays on Soloveitchik is that though he summarizes and analyzes Soloveitchik's essays, Halakhic Man and Halakhic Mind, very lucidly and insightfully, he tends to interpret those essays in light of the lonely man of faith, tends to interpret the lonely man of faith in light of its more pessimistic second half, dealing with our contemporary conditions, and tends in his discussion of the second half to focus on our key passage. So let's turn to Sachs's next essay on Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Halakhic Man, which appeared in 1985, 2 years after Ish Halakha's English translation. For our purposes, what is significant is that Sachs identifies as present in Halakhic Man, to be sure in a subdued mode, the notions of the divided self, religious man's loneliness, and Adam II's withdrawal, that in his earlier essay, Alienation and Faith, he had identified and criticized as the major motifs pervading the lonely man of faith. So I'll pass over Sachs's discussion of the divided self in Halakhic Man and move to a discussion of Halakhic Man's alleged loneliness and withdrawal. Sachs, rather tenuously in my view, uncovers their presence in Halakhic Man through an argument from silence. He maintains, I'm quoting from Rabbi Sachs, a sense of loneliness permeates the work. There is little in Halakhic Man where there could have been so much about the delights of intellectual companionship. For Soloveitchik, Sachs contends, the friends of modern Halakhic Man are people of the mind. And he cites as proof Soloveitchik's declaration, the consciousness of Halakhic Man embraces the entire company of the sages of the Torah. He walks alongside Maimonides, listens to Rabbi Akiva, senses the presence of Abaye and Rabbi. Sachs's subsequent comment, however, seems to possess only a slender, if any, basis in Soloveitchik's text. But his peers are of the past. This is talking about Soloveitchik. The present offers little to him, the Halakhic Man. The people around him are impatient, secular. This supposition regarding Halakhic Man's impatient, secular contemporaries, which again has no textual basis, enables Sachs to segue directly into our key passage from the lowly man of faith, which he proceeds to cite. When the hour of, again, the same passage again, when the hour of estrangement strikes, the ordeal of the man of faith begins, and he starts his withdrawal from society. He returns like Moses to a solitary hiding place and to the abode of loneliness. This connection that Sachs draws here between halakhic man and lonely man of faith strikes me as more a matter of literary legerdemain than a solid link. Certainly we find no withdrawal from society to a solitary hiding place in this famous passage of halakhic man. Halakhic man takes his stand in the midst of concrete world, his feet planted firmly on the ground in reality and publicly protest against the oppression of the helpless. He's the father of the orphans, the judge of widows, the actualization of the ideals of justice and righteousness, is the pillar of fire which halakhic man follows when he as a rabbi and teacher serves his community. So no withdrawal there. In the next essay of Rabbi Sachs, written in 1988, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik's early epistemology, reviewing Soloveitchik's 1986 monogram, Halakhic Mind, Sachs does not cite from the key passage we have been discussing, but still argues that in many ways the cognitive pluralism developed and espoused in that essay leads to the world of the lonely man of faith. Again, for purpose of time, I'll skip over the essay, Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Conflict and Creation, written in 1990 for his collection of essays, Tradition in an Untraditional Age, and turn to Sachs's extraordinary discussion of Soloveitchik in the introduction to that volume, which Miriam Feldman-Kay referred to last night, which I assume, like introductions in general, was written last. Sachs here is even more upfront in claiming that the tragic era of lonely man of faith was already present in halakhic man and halakhic mind 20 years before. In this connection, he makes what I have to confess to me is a very strange claim, that halakhic man, and I'm quoting from Rabbi Sachs, sees halakha not as the discipline of resolving conflicts, but as a celebration of conflict, to which, if there is a resolution at all, lies in the mystical depths of the soul, not in the world of action, human relationship, and society. I have to say, this seems to me to confuse halakhic man with his opposite, homo religiosus, and Reb Chaim Brisker with Kierkegaard. There's much to be said about this passage and others in the introduction, but again, I move to the key passage from Lonely Man of Faith, which Rabbi Sachs quotes, this time which he sees as an example of religious fear. The title of the section in the introduction where he cites this passage, the religious fear against which I mentioned yesterday, Reb Nachman of Rossum warns against. So Sachs writes, the lonely man of faith ends with a conclusion. And here we have the quote again. When the hour of estrangement strikes, the ordeal of the man of faith begins, and he starts his withdrawal from society to a solitary hiding place and to the abode of loneliness. He retreats from the encounter. And Sachs continues and reflects. This is extraordinary. I found almost 16 years ago, as I still find today, these words to be among the most profound written about the Jewish condition of modernity, and at the same time, the most despairing. That's interesting. They're among the most profound, but the most despairing. Jewish thought must confront them constantly. Means must confront Soloveitchik's words constantly. Must confront Soloveitchik's philosophy of withdrawal constantly, and constantly fight against them. It's here on your hand. I repeat, Jewish thought must confront these words of Soloveitchik and constantly fight against them. This is an extraordinary criticism which Sachs at the end of this section sharpens by arguing that Soloveitchik's position on the need for withdrawal, like that of Rabbi Moses Sofer, the Chatam Sofer, are examples of premature despair, and I quote, which must be resisted as its opposite, premature messianism. Examples of which Rabbi Sachs gives in another place in the introduction are Reform Judaism and secular Zionism. So on the right we have the extreme of withdrawal of the Chatam Sofer Rabbi Soloveitchik, and on the left we have the premature messianism of Reform Judaism and secular Zionism. That's rather interesting Okay, yeah, I'm almost finished. But to return to Sachs's main criticism, Jewish thought, I'm going to quote you, Jewish thought must constantly confront these words of Soloveitchik and constantly fight against them. What this means is that all of Sachs's later books, Dignity of Difference, To Heal a Fractured World, The Home We Build Together, and Morality, with their philosophy of engagement, of addressing secular society with a religious message, all of them should be seen as directed against, as a confrontation with and a fight against what Rabbi Sachs sees as Rabbi Soloveitchik's philosophy of withdrawal. This, I believe, is undeniable. And so I think it's black on white. But what would Rabbi Soloveitchik say if he and Rabbi Sachs were here in person today, as we are sure they are here with us in spirit? I imagine he would say, I'm making myself out. Okay, but I actually think this is what he would say, actually. But Rabbi Sachs, here's Rabbi Soloveitchik talking, right? But Rabbi Sachs, look what you've done in all your wonderful books. You write a religionist providing defense of liberal democracy, as halting a slide from we to I, as building families and communities. All true. But how did you then translate religion into cultural categories, addressed to Adam the first, and phrased in terms that he can understand? And aren't you running the risk against which I warn, of neglecting, of forgetting about Adam II's message of absolute commitment and the aboriginal faith experience, which transcends cultural categories and cannot be fully translated into them? Presumably, Rabbi Sachs would reply that the message he has to bring to general society is so critical that he is willing to run the risk, and that there are ways of minimizing it. And I imagine he would conclude, V'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. And presumably Rabbi Soloveitchik would say, well, maybe you should be afraid. So you can continue this imaginary dialogue by yourselves and pick your sides. But what this means is that the positions of these two giants, these two titans, ends in a profound standoff, which is an appropriate place to end this talk.